In this video I will show you how to make a long exposure without an ND filter, and I'm going to photograph that boat. I actually have a hard time remembering when was the last time I was out photographing, because wow, it has been a long time since I've had a dedicated photography outing. My landscape composition week project has just taken up so much time here in the end of March and into April. But it has turned out really well, and the masterclass, the first part, has come and gone, and the next one will be on Saturday. If you didn't have a chance to register for it, sadly the registrations are closed. Maybe we will do this again in the future, but for now I'm just really happy to be back out again. I've missed it so much. So since I learned about this boat wreck here last summer, I really wanted to photograph it. I think the story goes that a new owner bought the boat from an old owner, and then there were some issues with the boat, and then he had some problems, and now there's some insurance stuff going on, whether it's the old owner or the new owner who is supposed to pay for the wreckage and removal. But at the very least, until then, it makes for a great subject in photography. And I've been thinking a lot about how to actually photograph this boat. Should I shoot it like in a stormy weather scene, which kind of makes sense in regard to what it is, a ship wreckage. But I also really want to go for something very clean, very minimal, very simple. So I will simply just make a very long exposure to completely smooth out the water, hopefully get a little bit of a reflection effect in there, and then just on a completely clean background. How much of the sky I'm going to use in regard to gradation, I'm not entirely sure, but at the very least the concept is just a completely clean scene. It's still a little bit early in the day, so I need to wait for the sun to dip a little bit further down, and then I will talk about how to make a long exposure without filters. But first things first, we need a tripod, because we are taking a long exposure, and just like a traditional long exposure with a filter, you will need to keep the camera still for the amount of time that you are exposing. And since we are at the water, I can also highly recommend a couple of wellies. Because it is April, there I am, it is April, and the water is ice cold. So as we are making a long exposure, the exposure triangle is still the same thing. We need to keep our ISO low and our aperture closed down as for us to get as long a shutter speed as possible. There are two basic ways to make sure that your exposure time gets longer, and that is to shoot in dark environments. So obviously I can just wait for the blue hour or night and photograph the boat, which I'm definitely going to do. But there is also another way, and that is to take a lot of exposures and then stack them in Photoshop. And I'm of course going to show you how to do exactly that a little bit later in the video. But for now, let's take the exposures. And taking the exposures also comes with a little tip, because you definitely do not want to touch your camera. So as I said, it's all about getting as long as an exposure as possible, because we're still doing long exposures. So as you can see here, I have actually taken my ISO all the way down to 50. Right now I'm shooting at f22, and that gives me a shutter speed of about half a second, 0.4 seconds. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm first taking one frame at f11 just to get the boat sharp, and then afterwards I will go all the way to f22 because I don't really need to have it sharp here in front of me with the water. So let's say that I have a shutter speed of like 1/3 of a second. If I want a 30-second long exposure, I want the same effect as a 30-second long exposure, then I will need 3 exposures for 1 second, which means I will need 90 exposures to emulate a 30-second long exposure, right? So in that way you can simply just multiply up. It's fairly simple. So I can just wait like, 15 minutes more and it will be a little bit more dark and I will get maybe a 1 second exposure. So if I want a 90-second long exposure, I will again have to take 90 exposures of 1 second each. And in that way, when I put it all together in Photoshop, it will just smooth out the water completely. It is important to keep the tripod completely still. So being out on a day with a lot of storm and a lot of wind, it can be a little bit hard. Also remember to, in my opinion, I think the safest bet is to take off image stabilization. When you are putting your tripod here in the water, make sure to extend the lowest part first. First and foremost, so you don't get sand and dust and whatever's in the water, salt, into your tripod, the entire tripod, but simply also because the lower section of the legs are thinner, so the water can easily come around the tripod and simply not shake it as much as the upper part of the tripod. I think that is all. So now I will take the exposures. I am using the built-in intervalometer to take my exposures, so I just have a delay of 2 seconds and then I have a 1 second delay in between each exposure. So in that way, if I have like 1 second exposure, then it should time it correctly. But if I have a 2 second exposure, then I will have to up that interval a little bit. But you can play around with those things yourself. If you don't have a built-in intervalometer in your camera, you can always get an external intervalometer or just a wire trigger, but then you will probably have to hold it down yourself all the way through the exposures. So very simple. A few words about the composition before we get into Photoshop and show you how to stack it. As I said, right now I'm actually trying to make the exposure for the thumbnail here, but I will also take one where I turn the camera a little bit more so I have the boat further over in the screen, and then I will also go for a vertical, and I will probably also try to play around with some of the stones here to maybe introduce a little bit of foreground. Not entirely sure, but I will just play around with that. If you enjoy this video so far, I'd highly appreciate a like. It's completely free and goes a long way to support the channel. I use Adobe Bridge to browse my files on my hard drive and do the initial editing in Adobe Camera Raw. As you can see, I made sure to mark the first frame of a new sequence of photos. The next frame is the sharp one, shot at f11, and in this case the next 120 frames are the exposures I'm gonna stack and blend. You can also see that I have divided the 120 frames into stacks of 30 as to not crash my computer with these 42 megapixel files. I load the first 30 files into Photoshop layers, select them all and convert them to a smart object. This does take a few minutes depending on your system. Once the layers has been converted to a smart object, it's time to blend the stack. You simply go to the Layers tab, select Smart Objects, select Stack Mode, and then Median. This will also take a little loading time. When it's done loading, the water ought to smooth out and everything in the scene that didn't move ought to be sharp, unless something shook the camera. If you're satisfied with the blend, you just save this file to the hard drive and repeat the process with the other stacks of photos. When you're done with all 4, it is very advisable to rasterize the layers. You can also do this just after the blend. This removes the Smart Object feature but keeps the blending effect, with the result of reducing the file size and RAM usage. Once this is done, you stack the 4 new layers and repeat the Smart Object layer blending process a last time. Now you ought to have a long exposure effect of all the original photos in one big blend. Remember to rasterize this new layer too. It is now time to import the single sharp exposure. I simply drop it on top of the new layer and blend the boat and foreground stones in with some regular masking using my brush tool. After that, I finish up with a little bit of editing, and this is how you make a long exposure without any filter. It is a tedious process to blend all the layers, but there is of course a downside to not owning an ND filter. Some cameras can actually do this process in the camera via a multi-exposure setting, but my Sony a7R III can't. Besides this photo, I also made a couple of black and white photos that I actually think turned out even better, and they required less exposures as I took them during the late blue hour. Let me know down below which one is your favorite, and if you learned something from this video, I'd highly appreciate both a like and a subscribe. And if you want to learn more about composition, I have ebooks available, or even more about editing, you can enroll in my huge Photoshop for landscape photographers from beginner to advanced course. There are links in the description of the video, and remember to use the coupon code to get a discount on the Photoshop course. Thanks a lot for watching.